3 foundational punch needle stitches. I call these foundational because they are among the few stitches that are both decorative, they look good, and functional. And by knowing these stitches, you'll be able to use them in things like rugs, mats, all of those practical and functional items that can be created with punch needle rug hooking. So let's get started. So first we've got the straight stitch. This is the most basic punch needle stitch, so many of you will probably know what this is. But what many of you might not know is that there are differences depending on what needle and what yarn you use. Allow me to demonstrate using my Oxford 10 regular punch needle and some weight 6 rug yarn. For this yarn weight, your stitch size will depend on what part of your project you're working on. Generally, you want to make 6 stitches per inch for your 2 outer rows of your project, any outlines, any single lines, and details. You want to make 6 stitches per inch because you want crisp lines, not broken lines. You also want to make 6 stitches per inch for your 2 outer rows so that your project edges look clean and there's no foundation fabric showing once you hem your project. An easier way to remember this is by thinking about it in terms of the holes that are in your monk's cloth. So making 6 stitches per inch is equal to punching in every other hole of your monk's cloth. And for this yarn weight, you want to fill the rest of your project in using 4 stitches per inch. We can make bigger stitches when we're filling things in with punch needle because we have more room to move around, and smaller stitches tend to overcrowd and bulge, and it doesn't look great. And 4 stitches per inch is equal to punching into every third hole of your monk's cloth. So you've punched a row of stitches. Where do you punch your next row? So for row spacing with the straight stitch, you want to punch your next row so that your needle is just grazing the previous row. I usually just skip a row of holes in my monk's cloth. And in general, you should aim for about 7 rows per inch. By now, you may have caught on to the fact that I keep using terms like rows per inch and stitches per inch, and you might be thinking to yourself, is she actually going in with a ruler and measuring 1 inch everywhere she goes? Dear viewers, I am not doing that. Do not worry. There is a much easier way to ensure that you have the correct stitch spacing, and that is using a stitch gauge. If you use the Oxford punch needles like I do, they will come with a stitch gauge, but you can also DIY one by cutting out a 1 by 1 inch square from a piece of cardstock. Now let's say you made all of your stitches and you throw a stitch gauge right on top of them. If you see 7 stitches per inch where there should be 6, or 5 stitches per inch where there should be 4, don't freak out. It happens. Move your stitch gauge over. If you see the proper spacing in general throughout your project, you are still good to go. And let's say you run into a situation where you're punching and you're almost finished with a square or a rectangle and you have a little bit of space left where 1 stitch is too big and 2 stitches are too small. What do? Go with the smaller stitches. Making 2 smaller stitches is always better than making 1 stitch that's too big. And for the straight stitch, spacing will also be different for a finer yarn. And I want to just make this clarification. In punch needle, we generally refer to a weight 4 worsted Aran weight yarn as a fine yarn. So for punching the straight stitch with a fine yarn, you want to make 10 to 12 stitches per inch. That's basically equivalent to punching in every hole of your monk's cloth. And just like with your weight 6 rug yarn, you want to skip a row of holes between each row of stitches. Now with other less common yarn weights or fibers, you'll have to do some experimenting. I don't know the optimal stitch spacing for every single yarn or fiber out there, but I do have some insights that I can share with you. So this is a project that I'm working on, with an in-between yarn, and I'm making 6 to 7 stitches per inch, spacing 2 rows of stitches right next to each other, and then skipping a row, and repeating this over and over until I'm finished. For a super fine yarn, so something that's even thinner than a weight 4 yarn, you're going to want to punch in every single row and every single hole of your monk's cloth. For number 6, 7, or 8 cut wool fabric strips, you want to go 6 stitches per inch throughout. With the 7 and 8 cuts, those tend to be wider, so you want to skip 2 rows of holes before punching your next row of stitches. The 6 cut is thinner, so you only have to skip 1 row of holes. For 3 cut wool fabric strips, treat them like you're punching with fine yarn. You'll honestly just have to do some experimenting to find the optimal stitch spacing for whatever yarn or fiber you're punching with. And folks, that is not beginner level stuff, but I did want to say it because people always have questions about it. My advice to you is start with the basics, and in time, you'll be able to punch with anything. So next we have the stem stitch, and if the straight stitch was a level 1 beginner stitch, the stem stitch is what I'd call a level 2, an intermediate level stitch. This stitch is used for the 2 outer rows of your project, single lines, letters, that sort of deal. So when you're making the stem stitch with a weight 6 rug yarn, you want to make 6 stitches per inch, aka every other hole of your monk's cloth, and leave a row of holes before your next row of stitches. So let me show you the stem stitch. We start off kind of the same way we do a straight stitch, but instead of holding my needle in the direction I'm punching, I'm turning it 90 degrees to the left. Visualize it kind of like a clock. With straight stitch, you are punching at midnight, and with stem stitch, you are punching at 9 p.m. So we're going to keep our needle turned 90 degrees to the left, and we are just going to punch like this. And by doing so, we can see here that it creates really nice tubular loops that kind of look like a stem, hence why it's called the stem stitch. And the stitch gives a really nice clean finish, and it's why it's so popular for the outer 2 rows of projects. Practice doing the stem stitch on lines and squares and rectangles first so you can get the hang of it. If you are punching a square or a rectangle and you want to turn a corner, just turn your needle and make sure that it's still 90 degrees to the left of the new direction you're punching. And if you'd like to do the stem stitch with some fine yarn, it's the exact same deal in terms of turning your needle 90 degrees to the left. The only exception is that you're making 10 to 12 stitches per inch, aka every hole of your monk's cloth, and you're leaving a row of holes in between. The way you hold your punch needle is still the same, just your spacing is different. And that is the key thing to remember about the stem stitch, especially if you want to use other yarns or fibers. You'll have to do some experimenting to find the optimal stitch spacing, but regardless of what your stitch spacing is, you always turn your needle 90 degrees to the left. And now I can show you the bead stitch, which is the hardest stitch you're going to learn in this video, and just an advanced level foundational stitch in general. Just like the stem stitch, it's great for your 2 outer rows of your projects, single lines, letters, that sort of deal. And before I show you the stitch, I want to give a huge shout out to fellow Oxford certified punch needle instructor Louise Culp for kind of discovering and perfecting the stitch for punch needle. I will link her work in the description of this video. So for this stitch, you will need 2 yarns of equal weight. So I'm going to start off by showing you this stitch with some rug yarn. So let's start with one color, and what I'm going to do right now is punch 3 stitches per inch, aka every 4th hole of my monk's cloth. These are some pretty big stitches. And I'm going to keep doing that until I'm finished. And once I'm done that, I'm going to switch to my second color of yarn. And I'm going to start punching with my second color right between the stitches of my first color in the exact same row and punch 3 stitches per inch until I'm finished. And let's take a look at the front. And as you can see, this creates a 2-color dot pattern with yarn. That kind of looks like beads, hence why it's called the bead stitch. Pretty cool, right? Because this stitch is thicker, you're going to want to skip 2 rows of holes before punching your next row of stitches. If you don't, your project is just going to be overcrowded and it won't look good. Just like the stem stitch, practice on lines and then squares and rectangles so that you can get the hang of it. It helps to plan out your spacing so that the bead pattern stays intact for things like corners. This is quite a complicated stitch, so you might mess up a bunch. Don't worry about it, just pull out your yarn and redo it. And if you are worried about your spacing, you always have your stitch gauge. And to do the bead stitch with some fine yarn, we're going to start with 1 color of our fine yarn and punch about 6 stitches per inch, aka in every other hole of our monk's cloth. Once we do that, we can switch to our second color and then start punching right between the stitches of the first color in the exact same row and the exact same stitch spacing, 6 stitches per inch every other hole. And as you can see, it creates the same effect. Since this is a fine yarn, leaving just 1 row of holes in between should be fine. And just like with the stem stitch, if you want to try this out with other yarns or fibers, you'll have to do a bit of experimenting to see what works and what doesn't. And with that, those are the 3 foundational punch needle stitches that you should know. Thanks so much for watching. Make sure to like this video and subscribe if you haven't already, and leave a comment if you found this helpful. Happy punching!